Hello, welcome to this final talk in my series on the Buddha's Middle Way. This series has gone through 6 previous talks. I'm not going to try and summarize them all this time, but you can see the book they're based on next to me here, The Buddha's Middle Way, published by Equinox. So do refer to that for more details on anything in the series, and all the previous talks are all available on YouTube. Okay, so this talk is about the Buddha as an archetype, and in a way that's kind of the culmination of one of the key ideas behind all the talks, which is to see the Buddha as a source of inspiration, or track the way in which the Buddha can be a source of inspiration. And to be a source of inspiration for us, the Buddha has to be relevant to us, and we have to understand the Buddha in a way that is relevant to us and will help us in the best way. So that's the kind of practical approach I've been wanting to take throughout. And in the second talk particularly, which was about the middle way versus enlightenment, I argued that it was important to put the middle way first, really, because the middle way was about our experience and our practice, bottom up as it were, from where we are now, whereas it's possible to interpret enlightenment in a top-down way, to interpret it in an absolute way, which you then impose on the middle way. And exactly the same issues are found here, I think, when we talk about the Buddha as a sort of image or symbol, as a source of inspiration, that you can have a bottom-up approach, which is about how does the Buddha inspire you in your practice, or you can have a top-down approach which starts with some sort of absolute assumption about the Buddha's status as a sort of independent thing, person, whatever, that you have to correspond to in some sense. So the key question that I've been asking throughout, really, but here as well, is not so much who was the Buddha. That's a historical question, possible interest, but not what I'm concerned with here. Not so much who was the Buddha, but why do you need the Buddha? What's the point of the Buddha, as it were, in our experience? And obviously the term Buddha means awakened one, and so the tradition of why we're interested in him at all is accompanied by various assumptions, various views about his status in the Buddhist tradition. So disentangling that can get quite tricky. But I think regardless of that history, and regardless of how the Buddha and his image has come down to us, there it's still going to be the case that our status as individuals now is that going to be that of needing guidance and inspiration. It's which means that whatever guidance and inspiration we get from the Buddha needs to be in some way tailored to or interpreted in a way that's relevant to us. So if we attribute authority to the Buddha, well, we have to be careful about what we mean by authority. Is it of a kind that helps us to develop? So is it of a kind that's really basically educative? So when I talked about the Buddha's ministry in the third talk, I talked a bit about the Buddha's educative approach in the dialogues, in the suttas, to teaching, and see the way in which he was trying to help people find their own way forward on the middle way. So we need to treat ourselves in the same way, I think, in the same spirit here, in the way we interpret the Buddha's authority. So again, it's not an absolute authority, but it can nevertheless be taken very seriously. And I think that should apply to any source of authority. And as a source of inspiration, it needs to be the kind that actually motivates us to practice, rather than projection. So projection is the alternative. So I'm going to say more about that as we go on later on, about how projection can be an unhelpful approach to the Buddha as an archetype. But if we're going to avoid absolutizing the Buddha, either his authority or his image, then the idea of an archetype is crucial, I think. So again, I'll say more in a minute about what I mean by an archetype. But before we do that, let's try and get a bit more into the spirit of the Buddha as an archetype by looking at some images. So if I perhaps show you some images, some of my favorite images of the Buddha. Maybe there'll be ones that appeal to you as well. So this is a example of an image of the Buddha from Gandara. So the Gandara images were produced in northwestern India under Greek influence. So you can see a Greek aspect to the style. It's a fusion of Indian and Greek styles in the Buddhas that were produced there. This is following the invasion of northwestern India by Alexander the Great and the influence that then followed. This is a similar one, which I think appeals to me for similar reasons, of a Gandhara figure. Here's a slightly more traditional one, but again an ancient Indian figure. This is from Sarnath, so the place where the Buddha was said to have delivered his first sermon. And so there you see more of the whole posture. Here he is turning the wheel of the Dharma, so he's in the symbolic position, which shows he is teaching, and it depicts his first address, which I talked about in the third of my talks. So lots of people respond to these sorts of images, and in fact it's quite amazing how popular the image of the Buddha has become. Not only in the West, not only can you find the Buddha in Indian handicraft shops or whatever, but also New Agey shops, but even in garden centres, certainly in Britain, you can just buy the Buddha as a garden ornament, and it's very popular. So obviously the image and the idea of the Buddha in some way speaks to a lot of people, even people who don't know anything much about Buddhism. And you might ask people about what they feel in response, and you'll get obviously different kinds of answers. But obviously the most popular first word that trips off people's tongues is calm, I think. Yeah, so they like having a Buddha in their garden, for example, because it reminds them of calm. But why is calm important? Now, I think you can associate calm with slow thinking, with mindfulness, with contextualizing. So if we slow down sufficiently, remove interrupting stresses, then we're able to examine our assumptions and put them in a bigger context than we would have done otherwise. So calm has this huge significance for us just as human beings. It's a general, universal thing, basically, that if we slow down a bit, if we're a bit calmer, then we might make better decisions. So this association, this way in which the Buddha speaks to us, could have quite an important practical effect on us. Obviously, maybe not very profound in many cases if you just see a Buddha in your garden, but it goes all the way up from there to much deeper relationship with a particular image, one that maybe you might meditate in front of, for example. So there's also an image that's also an association of the Buddha with deeper mindful experience, or indeed any other kind of intense, maybe jhanic, maybe other kinds of inspired experience. And also maybe an association with, perhaps you might say, wisdom and compassion. So wisdom, being able to make use of our experience to improve our judgment, and compassion, or imaginative awareness of ourselves and others. So these are functions, I would call them. They're ways in which the Buddha can inspire us, but they're obviously not unique to the Buddha. It's not that the Buddha image itself is magic in some sense, that no other image or no other thing could fulfill that function. It's just that the Buddha does particularly well fulfill that function, which I would describe as an archetypal function. So it's an associative function, but with something that's particularly important to all human beings. Okay, so let me say a little bit more then about the idea of an archetype. So or what we mean by archetype. So obviously the term archetype comes from work of Carl Jung, although the word is used rather loosely in some other contexts, or in various different forms in other contexts. But obviously I'm talking in a broadly Jungian way about the term archetype. I think the idea of the archetype has a vast potential, really, to decouple religion and the arts from absolute beliefs. If we can appreciate the role that archetypes play in our lives, and that appreciating archetypes doesn't involve absolute beliefs, so it doesn't have to, then we're in a position to engage with religion as profoundly as we need to, without adopting all this baggage of absolute beliefs that seems to go with the very word religion for most people. So that's why I think it's really important to think and talk about archetypes, particularly in the current West, in the current situation. So, I mean, the understanding of archetypes that I've arrived at gradually, as I say, owes a lot to Jung, but I've developed what I think of as a practical approach to archetypes. That is, focusing on what they do, rather than speculations about what they are. So I've kind of let go of various bits of baggage which I encounter in Jung and in Jungian talk about archetypes, which I just feel is unnecessary. So there's stuff about the collective unconscious, for example, and sort of Platonic ideas involved, which I think are really unnecessary to understanding and utilizing the way that archetypes occur in our experience. So a full account of that sort of practical approach is going to be coming out in another book of mine, which is due out the end of this year or beginning of 2022, and it's called Archetypes in Religion and Beyond. It will also be published by Equinox, and there I'll be exploring in more depth, both the idea of what an archetype is, but also the role it plays in our lives, what the different archetypes are, and also exploring their role both in religion and more widely in the arts and in other contexts, and even in politics. So what I'm going to say about archetypes isn't just, I mean, there is some stuff about it in the Buddha's Middle Way, but it's also in some of my other books, and it's also used in my other recent book, which is about Jung's Red Book, which is called Red Book Middle Way, which came out last year. Anyway, so the account of archetypes that I've developed there is to see an archetype as a function. So I don't mean function in a kind of reductive way. I mean something that happens in our experience, the way that archetypes operate in our experience. And archetypes operate or function through association. And association is what meaning basically is. So if we explore what's become known as the embodied meaning approach to meaning, particularly coming from the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson and others these days, then it becomes clear there that the best account that's been developed really of meaning, compatible with science as well as with experience, is the way in which we form associations through our lives, which you could see as neural links within our brains and nervous systems, but you could also just see as connections that we make when we are experiencing things. So yeah, there's a lot that I could talk about there, which I'm not going to go into, such as talking about cognitive models and metaphors and so on. There's a whole set of explanations about how meaning in general, including the meaning of words, is basically associative. But I think for the moment, all we need to do is appreciate the idea that meaning is about association, and that for something to have archetypal meaning for us just means that we have to make certain associations. But obviously those associations need to be helpful to us in a particular way. And archetypal meaning, I think, meets a common human need for inspiration. So kind of explaining this commonality, this way in which humans in general seem to need certain kinds of inspiration, can get you into all kinds of maybe unnecessarily speculative discussions. But all I can say, I think the best way of approaching this is to say, well, it seems to be common to all humans on the evidence so far, because it's just about the way in which we operate as humans, our needs as humans. Archetypes provide us with inspiration, and they do that particularly in a way that we need in order to overcome some of our common sort of limitations really as humans. And I think some of the key limitations are about sort of distractibility and lack of integration, that we might start off with one set of good intentions but fail to follow them through. We might wobble all over the place and fail to develop a clear and consistent judgment and way of acting. So we need inspiration to help us over those wobbles. Let me give you an example, say, using the Buddha of the Buddha image in action. That's a simple example of as an archetype. So supposing you're feeling half-hearted about meditating. You have been meditating in the past and you've been doing it a bit, but you kind of fallen off doing it, but then you walk into the room and you see the Buddha image which you've put there and you've been meditating in front of, and then something clicks. You make an association. Oh yes, the Buddha, meditation. So you sit down and you meditate, and once you've done that, then you feel better and you see the point of it again. So your motivation has been reconnected, as it were. And just the connection made when you saw the Buddha made the difference there. Obviously, it wouldn't have worked by itself. It depended on you being in that position where it would have made the difference. But nevertheless, it can make the difference. It not just in reminding you, yes, it's part of it, and motivating you. So that operates in the sort of realistic scenario of how unintegrated a lot of us are a lot of the time. So more generally, I think archetypes put us in touch with experiences of being more integrated. So sometimes we're more integrated than at other times. And if we can associate more integrated states with archetypes, then we can use archetypal images and symbols and so on to remind us of the possibility of being more integrated. So that's not about properties intrinsic to the symbol we're using. It's about our experience of that symbol. Although obviously that experience hasn't come out of a vacuum. It's built on cultural traditions and relationships. It may depend on our experience since childhood, a deep relationship with a particular symbol. But at least it depends on association we've built up. So obviously our ability to respond to symbols in general probably depends on practice, really, in being able to respond to symbols at all. So I think our ability to respond to symbols from another culture, a new culture, might well depend on our capacity to do so in the previous one, an earlier one. Anyway, so that's how I'd see archetypes in general as working. So obviously that's how the Buddha can inspire us as an archetype. Now, there are different types of archetype, and I think it's worth talking a bit about the different ways that the Buddha can inspire us as an archetype in relation to types of archetype. So I've taken to using a fourfold classification of archetypes. It is one that Jung uses in some places, but what gives it its value, I think, is its practical role, the way in which it summarizes or epitomizes something of the way in which archetypes work. So this diagram is a diagram of 4 key archetypes in relation to each other. So those 4 key archetypes are the hero, the shadow, the anima/animus, and the god archetype. Now, there are different possible labels for all of those things, and I'll particularly get to the god archetype and the label we use for that in a minute. But I think potentially all of these can be connected to the Buddha. So these show different ways that we can be inspired. So different ways that a symbol can remind us and help us to integrate. So let's start with the hero. So obviously, if you read about the Buddha, particularly the Buddha's early life, so Jungian commentators have particularly discussed this. People like Edward Edinger talked about the Buddha as a hero who's Joseph Campbell's another one actually, who's written about this as the hero who makes efforts towards goals, and the Buddha is obviously doing that. He's got this goal of enlightenment. He's making efforts towards it. So any hero can have this effect on us. It can remind us of the goals we've set ourselves and the need to persevere in pursuing those goals. And I think as the hero archetype gets more subtle, then it can also lead to modifications of those goals, and the goals can actually start to change somewhat. So it's not just a question of rigidly pursuing the same goal throughout. The hero may be so determined that he even has to re-examine the whole of what he's doing in order to fulfill the goal in a deeper sense. And that's exactly what the Buddha does. He sets out to he goes forth, he goes into the forest, he's got one idea of what it is he's trying to achieve, but in the forest he's disappointed with what he thinks he's achieving it, and the middle way interposes another way of thinking about what he's actually trying to do. So the Buddha can be a hero. Obviously, identifying strongly with a hero can have its dangers if you have a very rigid view of the goal, and you can get obviously heroes as business leaders that don't give up, or warriors or whatever, who are actually contributing a lot to conflict because of the rigidity of their goals. But the hero can be very helpful to us if it's put in a bigger context, and that this diagram kind of illustrates that context. So then another type of function, of archetypal function, is the anima animus. So this comes from the terms that Jung used. He used different terms for the anima, which is usually a male experience of the feminine, and the animus, which is usually a female experience of the masculine. And if you put them together, I think you get something like the attractive other. And personally, I don't think that they necessarily have to take a sexual form. But this isn't totally irrelevant to the Buddha, because obviously some people may find the Buddha attractive in that kind of way, and he is actually portrayed as attractive. He's often described as very attractive physically, and he's got all these marks of a great being, which are intended, at least in the Indian context, to reinforce that idea of an attractive being. So if you're attracted to the other, then this can help you engage with new qualities that are in the attractive being. So particularly the idea here is, if you're attracted, for example, if you're very masculine and you're attracted to a feminine figure, then this can help you. If it's done in a subtle enough way, it can help you to develop feminine qualities in yourself. And this relates to the idea in Buddhism of going beyond the limitations of a particular gender identification or sexual identification. So sometimes the Buddha is portrayed as androgynous for that reason. So there can be something somewhat sexually ambiguous about him. He can have a rather ambiguous looking chest, for example, when he's depicted. Okay, so then there's the shadow. So the shadow is everything we fear, and the rejected parts of ourselves, and the rejected things in the world. So the great example of the shadow is the encounter with Mara, which I did talk about a bit in the second talk in this series. So Mara represents the shadow, the bits that are of the Buddha's experience, the bits of the Buddha, if you like, that are dragging him back, that actually want him to return to states of delusion, or indeed of craving or hatred. So it's easy to forget if you think of Mara as this sort of figure who attacks the Buddha to try and stop him reaching enlightenment, then easy to forget actually Mara is part of the Buddha. That certainly psychologically that Mara is the Buddha. So you can think of Mara actually as an aspect of the Buddha, as an archetype of the Buddha, and that's reached its logical conclusion in some of the Mahayana depictions of so-called wrathful figures, which again show this sort of shadow side of an otherwise peaceful Buddha or Bodhisattva. Okay, so that's three kinds of inspiration, if you like, so far. So we've had the hero, achieving your goals, the attractive other, which is attracting you beyond your current limitations, so that you can engage with something that you've different from you, different from how you are now. And the shadow, which is it's challenging you. It's reminding you of the bits of yourself that you've rejected, and obviously the challenge there is to integrate it. And the Buddha managed to do that in the story of the assaults of Mara by remaining solid, by remaining in his practice rather than by being distracted by the assaults and temptations of Mara. Okay, so but around those three in the diagram we have the blue band, which represents the God archetype. So this I would take to represent our glimpses of the integrated whole. So any of the other archetypes could be developed into the God archetype as the kind of source of inspiration for our potential, for potential that we haven't understood yet, that we've maybe just glimpsed, that goes beyond our current identifications and what we think we are or what we think we can do. An image I like to use for this is, so imagine you are standing in a high place in the dark, but then suddenly a storm comes in and there's a flash of lightning, and in the flash of lightning you see a huge, enormous landscape in front of you, but only for a second, and then it's gone. So that absolutely awe-inspiring glimpse of a vast landscape is a bit like an experience of the God archetype. So if you have a sense of much bigger potential, as it were, than you recognized before, see, that can be in some ways terrifying, at least awe-inspiring, or it can be also attractive. So it can have any of the qualities of the other archetypes we've talked about. It can be somewhat threatening, it can be attractive, it can be a goal. But the more subtly we pursue the other archetypes, the more they tend to turn into this bigger sense of potential. So the God archetype, so called, could take all kinds of forms that have that function. So obviously for some people, calling it the God archetype is a bit loaded. So that's, I find it a useful label just because I think it's the most common way in which people in the West tend to experience it or talk about it. But if you don't like the label, you could of course call it the Buddha archetype, or indeed you could call it the archetype of nature with a capital N, or the sublime, or the good, or there were all kinds of other concepts that fulfill that same function, I think, for us. So if it's too much like a bossy old man in the sky, then don't use the term. It's really up to you. But the important thing about this, I think, is that we can have religious experiences which are, they can be their greatest. They can be life-changing experiences, very profound experiences, which we call religious experiences. But they show our common human capacities to experience all this meaningful potential. They don't justify a belief in God. They're an experience is an experience, and it can be a very inspiring experience without coming with all this unnecessary baggage. So if you think about that as that, a way of understanding religious experience in relation to the God archetype, very much the same points apply to the Buddha in the context of Buddhism. If you have an experience which you think is a kind of Buddha experience, so you could have, for example, a profound experience of samadhi, or of insight, or of intense jhana. Those profound experiences you might think of as Buddha experiences. You might associate them with the image of the Buddha. But they don't particularly justify a belief in the Buddha, or belief in the Buddha's enlightenment as a kind of discontinuous state, or a state of absolute knowledge. And they also don't justify you in thinking that you have achieved some sort of state of absolute knowledge, however insightful your experience may have been. This is all really, I think, the really important distinction between meaning and belief. That constantly people tend to sort of understand meaning in terms that are taken from belief rather than seeing meaning as something distinct. So the Buddha archetype can be something really meaningful to us, or that the Buddha can stand for the God archetype, basically, or have the function of the God archetype. It doesn't necessarily come with beliefs either about God or about the Buddha's status. And that takes us to the issues of rejection. So whenever we have like a relationship with an archetype, whenever it inspires us, there is also a danger that we project it, and that can undermine the value of the experience of the archetype. So if we experience the archetype in an integrated way, then we can take responsibility for it. We can acknowledge it as an aspect of our own experience. But when we project it, we in some way or another take the archetype to be an object, take the archetype to be this thing, often a supernatural entity, the devil out there, the God out there, the Buddha in history who gained enlightenment, etc. When it's it's an aspect of our experience that we're talking about. Sometimes also projection could be on ourselves, so we could think that we ourselves are God or the devil or the Buddha or whatever. So it's not necessarily an object; it could also be a subject. But either way, the term projection suggests a projector, as in the picture there, and also that we're as it were looking at a picture on the screen, and we don't realise it's a picture on the screen. We don't realise there's a screen there and a projector putting that image there, as it were. The projector is in our heads. It's an unconscious process in our heads, and we think we're seeing the real thing, as it were. So I suppose when one points this out, unfortunately, it's often taken as some sort of psychological reduction, which it really isn't. It really doesn't have to be. So it's not in any way a deflation of the experience or the meaning of the archetype. And I think if you doubt that, then I'd really recommend reading Jung's Red Book, because one of the amazing, striking things about Jung's Red Book is, it's a record of Jung's personal encounters with his internal archetypal figures, and all the way along, he recognizes that's what they are. They're archetypal figures, but that doesn't stop him having incredibly powerful experiences, and struggling in all sorts of ways with these internal figures, which he has to take seriously. So really, that if we don't believe in something in this sort of projective fashion, it really doesn't stop us from taking them seriously or being inspired by them. And it's that's important in practical terms. So vital, I think, to get rid of this sort of deflationary expectation or reductive expectation that some people have with psychological discussion of religious phenomena, because it's really not necessary. Obviously, some psychologists may be setting out to do that, but that's not necessary to the approach. So, some examples of projection. An obvious example is, say, projection of the animus. So, say if a man falls in love with a woman, then you believe that the woman really does have all the qualities that you have the potential to develop in yourself. Yes, so if you believe that this woman is infinitely beautiful and loving, for example, then it's your own potential to be those things which you are seeing in her, rather than the actuality of the probably much more complicated, mixed up human being which you're actually looking at. So that's obviously one kind of projection where we insist that we're seeing something out there having these particular qualities that we are projecting, rather than seeing complexity. And obviously where God is concerned, then what we're doing is we're taking an archetypal experience and making that a basis of belief. So we insist then on God being a thing out there, a thing separate from us in some sense. Now, if we're talking about projection of the Buddha, then I think that involves attributing our own experience of potential to the Buddha himself. And that could be done either by becoming obsessed with him as a historical figure, and perhaps with whether we've got the true Buddha who really was enlightened at this point and really did produce these truths in words and so on, or just as a source of supreme authority, even if we're not too fussed about the history. Perhaps that authority is channeled through a particular Buddhist sect or cult or tradition, and particularly, the tradition of gurus in the Tibetan tradition, so has a lot of that potential coming with it, as many people have discovered, of projecting absolute authority onto a guru figure who is the proximate Buddha, who is the replacement of the Buddha for you. So either way, if you're projecting onto the Buddha, then it becomes really important whether the Buddha was really enlightened, etc., rather than encountering the figure of the Buddha and recognizing it as something you need as a source of inspiration. Okay, so the archetype, or an archetype, can be distinguished from the idea of authority. So when we're talking about the Buddha as an archetype, it's probably important to distinguish that from the Buddha as an authoritative teacher, as such. So an archetypal function is not specific to a particular symbol, and this is a very common confusion, I think, that people think that the archetype is the symbol in some way, but an archetypal function is very flexible, and so the God archetypal function could operate through the Buddha or lots of other things. However, the authority of the Buddha is not so flexible. It's much more specific to the meaning of the Buddha in particular. So the meaning of the Buddha, as I've been discussing him really in previous talks in this series. So the example and the guidance of the Buddha, the things he said during his ministry, for example, the way he taught, the example of his early life, of finding the middle way. These are much more specific to the Buddha. Not every figure has that symbology, that particular set of ideas and concepts and history and so on attached to him or her, even if they are archetypal. So obviously this is another aspect of human needs. In some ways we do need authority. It's an aspect of human values. We need some sort of, particularly when we're children, we need a parent figure, for example, who has authority, and when we encounter lots of other authorities as we grow up. But it's not always the overriding value, and as we get older, then we find other values are just as important to us. So authority obviously is in tension with freedom, which is also an important value for a lot of people. So it's vital not to absolutize either of those. Either that what is authoritative is always right, or indeed that what is free or reminds us of freedom is always. Seeing them in context. So that's why the Buddha's authority is always a matter of degree. And in practice, I think that means that his advice needs to be weighed up rather than accepted unconditionally. And to be able to weigh it up in practice, I think, does mean comparison. Comparison to alternatives, that we do have alternatives in mind. Otherwise, if we're just presented with, as it were, one set of instructions or one example, then we'll just through confirmation bias, we might be likely to just adopt that without any sense of whether it's actually better than the alternatives. So not to absolutize, I think, requires us at least to be prepared to investigate alternatives, which is not generally part of religious traditions, even the Buddhist tradition. To go through a process of discussing alternatives in a deliberate way, not just discussions so that you are converted fully to the views of the great teacher or whatever, but discussions so that you have weighed up possibilities. So again, I think that's something that to be really in the spirit of the Buddha's middle way, I'd like to see Buddhist organizations do more critical thinking. So yeah, basically we're responsible also for our interpretation of the Buddha's advice and what we take his authority to be. And often if we absolutize authority, then that's obviously tied in with a projection of the archetype. And either way, we substitute the image of the Buddha and the authority of the Buddha as a substitute for our own responsibility, really, for what we do with the Buddha and his image, his teachings. So treating the Buddha archetypally is entirely compatible, I think, with thinking of the Buddha's authority as a matter of degree, weighing it up with other sources, treating it as a matter of credibility rather than absolute authority. Okay, but obviously that approach is somewhat in tension with the tradition of faith and going for refuge in Buddhism. So just before we finish, I'd like to just say a little bit about those, because the term faith is a little bit vexed, I think, in Buddhist tradition. So the Buddhist term for faith, usually translated as faith, is saddha or shraddha, sometimes that's translated as something like confidence or trust, or confidence trust, and that's what you could call bottom-up faith, I think. So if we have confidence that we can do something, or that also that a person that we've had some connection with is reliable, then that's trust based on our experience. We haven't just come across them and immediately projected an absolute position onto them. We've arrived at a position of trust and confidence. So we can have confidence in ourselves, and we can have trust in other people, and that can be done in a sort of a way that's based on embodied awareness and clarity and decisiveness, but based on previous experience. And that's really based on experience of our own actions in the body. So if you're learning to ride a bicycle or to swim or something, we get confident in those things, and we start to have faith in ourselves doing those things through a very embodied process, whereby we gradually gain confidence in our physical actions. So we keep repeating our experience, and we get more and more confident. But faith can work in exactly the same way, I think, in the sense that you can study the Buddha, you can discuss his ideas and so on, and look at his example and his archetypal image, and you can find it trustworthy, either as guidance or as archetypal association. So in that sense, you could have faith in the Buddha in this bottom-up way, which I think is saddha interpreted in the most helpful sense. But very often Buddhists alternatively interpret Saddha as something like being convinced of the Buddha's awakening. And that takes you, I think, straight into top-down ways of thinking about faith, much more like, a maybe slightly stereotyped view of Christian faith, which is basically absolute belief. Faith as a kind of euphemism for absolute belief. So you've got a set of propositions which you think must be true, and so you have faith in those propositions. You absolutely believe them. The fact of the Buddha's awakening, as far as I can see, is just an abstraction. It's just another absolute source of absolute belief, if that's what you're focused on. There's a contrast here between a kind of top-down and bottom-up interpretation of faith, which could be absolute belief top-down, or it could be bottom-up. And the bottom-up approach could combine an archetypal inspiration with an incremental confidence. Now, the tradition of going for refuge in Buddhism, which includes the public reciting of the refuges, is traditionally supposed to be based on faith. So it will be an expression of faith. So traditionally, Buddhists say, I go for refuge to the Buddha, I go for refuge to the Dharma, I go to refuge to the Sangha, and those are the three jewels of Buddhism. So that's seen as very much as a commitment to practice. Obviously, has slightly different roles in different branches of the Buddhist tradition, but it was very much emphasized in Triratna, which is the Buddhist tradition I've had most experience of. So the idea of going for refuge, well, it could again just be a way of committing yourself to a relationship, to an archetype. So a way of reminding yourself, just like the Buddha on your table, which you're about to sit in front of as an inspiration to meditation. Your recitation of the refuges or whatever could have that role potentially. Could just be a source of inspiration connected to commitment. So the commitment is something that helps to remind you of your relationship to it. But again, so there's a bottom-up and a top-down interpretation of this, but a top-down interpretation would be much more like an absolute commitment to a set of beliefs about, the Buddha was enlightened, the Dharma is the true teaching, the Sangha is the community of people who stream entry and so on. So there is an alternative stream in Buddhism of interpreting going for refuge in that way. But I do think the three jewels can be interpreted in ways that are bottom up. The Buddha particularly is a source of archetypal inspiration in the path and indeed guidance. The Dharma particularly is advice for the path, and the Sangha is solidarity with others. So we need the support of others, certainly. This solidarity with others rather than power from the group, which will be the top-down version. But that way of interpreting the refuges, I think, is non-exclusive as well. It implies that other people using different symbols who aren't Buddhists at all could also be going for refuge in this sense. So there could also be other people who are inspired by an archetype representing their potential, who have some sort of guidance available to them that helps them to develop, and they have solidarity with a group of people. So I think if Buddhists are adopting what they really sincerely believe is a bottom-up approach to this, then it will apply a non-exclusivity in the way that they're interpreting the three refuges. So one of the reasons why I'm not a committee Buddhist, why I don't regularly recite those things myself anymore, why I don't call myself a Buddhist, is I think a lack of clarity in that language and in the ritual where that language is used. So it's rarely clear to me that it's definitely about a bottom-up interpretation to the people involved and not a top-down one. So again, that takes us to enlightenment as a top-down source of authority versus the middle way as the bottom-up path. Okay, so that takes me round about to the end of my talk. But yeah, I can't see any questions yet. So if you do want to ask any questions, please do type them into the chat. I'll try and answer them. But I'll just give a minute while we give it a minute for those to come through. I'll just say a little bit to sort of round off this series of talks. So yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning, these talks were all about the Buddha's middle way, and they kind of scratched the surface really. They talked about some of the key points in the book, The Buddha's Middle Way, but there's a lot more in the book. So again, I would obviously, being the author, I would recommend that you go to the book for more detail and more exploration of anything I've talked about. But also stuff I've talked about today, you can find out a lot more about archetypes and the use of archetypes either in my book Red Book Middle Way, which was published last year, or in my upcoming book, perhaps more systematically in my upcoming book, Archetypes in Religion and Beyond. Okay, but as to whether there'll be any more talks, that's a distinct possibility. So I'm thinking in terms of more series of talks like this in the future, but I don't as yet have a date in mind when I will start doing them. So they will be advertised through whatever channels you found out about this one, both on YouTube, probably on Facebook, obviously through the Middle Way Society. You'll be able to find out about any future series of talks like this. Okay, and obviously if you want to find out any more about the Middle Way as a general approach, particularly the universal Middle Way, rather than just the Middle Way in a Buddhist context, then that's what the Middle Way Society is all about. So do visit our website, which is middlewaysociety.org, and explore the many resources we've got there about the universal Middle Way. Particularly the introductory videos under the media tab I would recommend for exploring some of the basics if you want to find out more. And I'm also very happy to, if you make contact with me by whatever means, to discuss these issues with you further. Okay, there were no further questions. There are no questions coming through to me now, so I will leave it there. Call this the end of the series. So thanks for listening. Hope you got something out of it, and goodbye.